nonsense, double King's Guard shouts 18 clueless tourists. Now standing on the bustling streets of central London, she couldn't believe she was finally here. With her camera in hand and her excitement bubbling over, Sarah was ready to take on the city, one famous landmark at a time. Her first stop was Buckingham Palace. Sarah had seen pictures of the impressive building and the guards that stood motionless in front of it. She had read somewhere that the King's Guard was a symbol of British tradition, but beyond that, she didn't know much about them. In her mind, they were just part of the palace's charm, figures standing tall, dressed in their red uniforms and black hats, adding to the spectacle of London's history. To Sarah, it all seemed like a well-practiced show for the tourists. She didn't think much more of it, assuming that the guards were there to be part of the tourist experience, much like the performers in Covent Garden or the street artists near the London Eye. Sarah, being a bit of a thrill seeker, had planned out her day meticulously. She wanted to see everything, so when she caught her first glimpse of the palace, her heart raced with excitement. The grand gates, the perfectly trimmed gardens, and the looming grandeur of the palace itself were everything she had imagined. As she walked closer to the gates, her eyes immediately landed on the iconic red-coated guards standing tall on the palace grounds. "They must be statues, right?" Sarah muttered to her friend Jane, who stood beside her. The two of them giggled, thinking it was a bit of a joke. "Surely nobody could stand that still for so long, could they?" "I don't know, they're kinda freaky," Jane replied, squinting at the soldiers who seemed to be made of stone. "Let's get closer." "I want a good selfie with them in the background," Sarah suggested, already moving toward the guards. Jane followed, a little hesitant but still laughing at the thought of taking a picture with the living statues. As Sarah drew closer, she noticed a few other tourists doing the same. Some were taking pictures from a distance, while others were standing right beside the guards, posing in front of them without a care in the world. Sarah felt confident. After all, she had seen plenty of photos of people smiling next to the guards who didn't seem to mind. Why not do the same? She reached out for her phone, excited to capture the perfect shot. She stood just a few feet away from one of the guards, who stood perfectly still, his tall bearskin hat barely moving in the breeze. She adjusted her angle, making sure the guard's stoic figure was framed just right behind her. Sarah made sure to stand directly beside him. With a grin on her face, she snapped a picture, her camera capturing both her beaming smile and the stern expression of the soldier. "This is going to be the best photo of the trip," Sarah laughed, taking a few more shots. But she didn't notice how close she had gotten, or how her movements were slowly beginning to disturb the guard's carefully controlled posture. As Sarah fidgeted with her camera, Jane continued to snap pictures of her, encouraging her to get even closer to the guard. Sarah, oblivious to the growing tension in the air, leaned in for a selfie with the guard, giving him a playful wink. It felt like a fun moment in the middle of her exciting day. She couldn't understand why people would consider the guards intimidating. After all, they were just standing there. But the truth was, Sarah was missing something crucial about the role of the King's Guard. These soldiers weren't performers. They weren't there for amusement or photo opportunities. They were protecting the palace, carrying out a duty that had been in place for centuries. Their presence was a sign of respect, tradition, and the continuity of a long-standing royal history. But Sarah, as many tourists do, misunderstood this. She didn't realize that there were strict rules surrounding how close a person could get to the guards, or how important it was to maintain a certain distance to show respect for their position. In her excitement, she had broken the unspoken rule of not interacting with the guards or getting too close to them. She had treated them like part of the set, a charming addition to the grand spectacle of London. But these guards weren't actors in a play. They were trained soldiers, tasked with keeping watch over one of the most famous royal residences in the world. While Sarah was lost in her excitement and the thrill of being so close to something so iconic, The guard she had approached was growing increasingly uncomfortable. Sergeant Major Thompson, who had been standing still for what felt like an eternity, was trained to block out distractions. But Sarah's behavior was hard to ignore. The close proximity, the flashing of her camera, and the blatant disregard for protocol were starting to bother him. He had been standing in his post for hours, upholding a tradition of dignity and respect. But this tourist, this clueless visitor, was treating his duty as a joke. As the minutes passed, the situation grew more tense. Sarah's smiles turned into a slight frown as she noticed that the guard wasn't responding the way she expected. He didn't smile or wave, and he didn't even glance her way. Instead, he kept his eyes forward, standing tall and unwavering. Sarah found it odd but didn't think much of it. She figured maybe he was just really good at playing his role, so serious and composed. But what Sarah didn't realize was that Sergeant Major Thompson wasn't playing at all. He was doing his job, and he wasn't there for her entertainment. His stoic expression wasn't part of some act. It was a necessary part of the role he had been entrusted with. And if anyone crossed the line, whether by getting too close, touching him, or engaging in any form of disrespect, he was trained to correct the situation immediately. As Sarah continued to snap photos, a quiet tension began to build, though she was still blissfully unaware of the guard's growing discomfort. To her, it was just another fun, light-hearted moment during her whirlwind tour of London. But to Sergeant Major Thompson, it was a breach of the solemnity of his duty, a moment where respect for tradition had been lost in the rush of modern-day tourism. The warm sunlight bathed the palace grounds, and tourists continued to filter in and out, chatting and snapping photos of the magnificent architecture. The hustle and bustle of the crowd was ever present, but amid the noise, one figure stood completely still: Sergeant Major Thompson, the King's Guard. He had been standing in the same spot for what felt like an eternity, his gaze locked straight ahead. To any passerby, he appeared like a statue, immovable, unyielding, and steadfast. His red coat and black bearskin hat stood out sharply against the pristine backdrop of Buckingham Palace. But beneath the uniform, beneath the rigid exterior, Sergeant Major Thompson was, in fact, a man with a job to do. For years, he had stood guard at some of the most famous landmarks in London, trained in the fine art of maintaining composure under pressure. He had dealt with crowds of tourists, cameras flashing in his face and people trying to test his patience. Yet, no matter how long he had stood in his post, he could always rely on his training to remain calm and professional. But today, something felt different. Something about the behavior of a young tourist nearby was starting to get under his skin. Sarah, oblivious to the growing tension, continued to click away at her camera. With each photo, she moved just a little closer to the guard, laughing and calling out to her friend Jane. They were having the time of their lives, enjoying their visit and thrilled at the chance to be so close to one of the most iconic symbols of British history. To Sarah, it was all part of the fun. After all, she had seen other tourists posing near the guards, even waving at them and making funny faces. Why should she be any different? As she took yet another selfie, this time standing almost shoulder to shoulder with the guard, she couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. This will be perfect for my social media, she thought, imagining the likes and comments she would get from her friends back home. But in the midst of her excitement, she missed something crucial: the subtle change in the guard's demeanor. Sergeant Major Thompson's eyes had not once shifted away from his forward position. His posture remained as stiff as ever, his arms locked firmly at his sides. But inside, his frustration was beginning to rise. He was trained to ignore distractions, but the line between respect and disrespect was growing dangerously thin. He had been patient, watching the young woman move closer and closer, oblivious to the space he needed to maintain in order to uphold the dignity of his post. It wasn't about personal space. It was about the respect owed to the position he held. His duty was not simply to stand guard, it was to safeguard the traditions that had been passed down through generations. These guards weren't hired actors or statues to be admired from a distance. They were symbols of continuity and service, part of a long history that had withstood the test of time. Sergeant Major Thompson wasn't just protecting a building. He was upholding a centuries-old tradition that required discipline, respect, and unwavering focus. But Sarah, caught up in the excitement of the moment, had no understanding of this. She continued to stand too close, her camera flashing in rapid succession, and her laughter echoing around the palace grounds. As the minutes passed, Thompson's patience started to wear thin. He had been polite at first, hoping she would realize her mistake, but the closer she came to him, the more intrusive her actions became. The line between curiosity and disrespect had been crossed. He had seen it all before, tourists trying to joke around, taking photos too close for comfort, treating him like some kind of performer. He had dealt with people waving, even trying to make the guards laugh, and others pushing the boundaries just to get a reaction. But the situation had escalated quickly. This wasn't a casual breach of etiquette. Sarah was now standing uncomfortably close to him, leaning in for another selfie, completely unaware of how close she was to breaking an unwritten rule. Sergeant Major Thompson had made his decision. He would no longer let this go unnoticed. The next step was clear. He would address the issue directly, and he would make sure the young tourist understood that this was not just a matter of personal space. It was about respecting the tradition, the institution, and the role he played in it. He had seen how easily such misunderstandings could spiral into larger problems, and he wasn't about to let that happen today. Taking a deep breath, Thompson stood even straighter, the muscles in his back tightening as he prepared to speak. He had been trained to respond with authority, and that was exactly what he would do. His voice would be loud and commanding, his words clear and firm. There was no room for misunderstanding now. "Step back, miss." The shout broke through the noise of the crowd, cutting through the chatter and the clicking of cameras. It was not a question, nor was it a suggestion. It was an order. Sarah froze, her finger still on the camera button. For a split second, she didn't quite register what had happened. The sound of his voice had been so sudden, so powerful, that it took her a moment to process. The smile on her face faded, replaced by a look of confusion. She glanced up, expecting to see a light-hearted grin, but instead the guard's expression was stern, his eyes cold and unblinking. There was no joke, no playful teasing, just a direct command. "What?" Sarah asked, her voice rising in surprise. She hadn't expected this. She took a step back, slightly irritated, unsure of what had just happened. She thought the guard might have been playing along, part of the act. After all, they were famous for their stoic expressions, weren't they? It didn't make sense to her why he would be upset. "Step back now," the guard repeated, his tone much louder this time. His boots echoed sharply against the cobblestones as he took a step forward, his large frame looming over her. The crowd around them seemed to quiet, some people looking on with curiosity, others sensing the tension that had suddenly filled the air. Sarah's friend Jane stood by, unsure of what to do. She had been snapping photos, laughing along with Sarah, but now the situation felt serious, and neither of them knew how to react. "Are you serious?" Sarah blurted out, still unable to comprehend the guard's reaction. She looked to Jane for some support, but her friend just stared at her wide-eyed. Sergeant Major Thompson did not flinch. He did not hesitate. "I said step back," he repeated, his voice unwavering. "This is not a joke. Show respect." For a moment, Sarah felt the weight of his words. The cheerful atmosphere from just moments ago was now gone, replaced by an uncomfortable silence. Sarah's face turned pink as she quickly backed away, realizing that the guard was not there to entertain her or anyone else. His role, his duty, was serious, and she had just learned a valuable lesson about respect and tradition. She looked at the guard one last time, her earlier confidence replaced by a sense of embarrassment. What had she done? Why had she not noticed the boundaries she had crossed? Sergeant Major Thompson, still unmoving, returned to his post. His posture was perfect, his eyes once again locked straight ahead. The moment had passed, but for Sarah it would not be forgotten. She stood there for a moment, the weight of the interaction settling in. The quiet that followed was thick, almost suffocating. The crowd around Sarah and Jane had grown noticeably still, and Sarah, still standing several feet away from the guard, was struggling to understand what had just happened. She felt a strange mix of embarrassment and disbelief, her mind racing as she tried to piece together the guard's sharp words. "Step back now," his voice had rung out, echoing in her ears. It wasn't a casual request, it was an order, a command. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she glanced around, catching the eyes of several other tourists who had witnessed the exchange. Some of them looked on with curiosity, others with a mixture of surprise and discomfort. No one seemed to be laughing anymore. Even Jane, who had been beside her, now looked uncertain, her usual carefree demeanor replaced by a worried frown. The atmosphere had shifted, and Sarah could feel it. For a moment, Sarah stood frozen, not sure what to do. She had never been in a situation like this before. Back home, she was used to getting smiles and waves from people when they saw her taking photos, even if they didn't know her. But this was different. The guard hadn't smiled. He hadn't even looked at her like she was just another tourist. Instead, he had treated her like an intruder, someone who had crossed an invisible line. She felt a knot form in her stomach, and the excitement she had once felt about being in London seemed to drain away. The grandiosity of the palace and the excitement of her first royal encounter suddenly seemed distant, as if the very air around her had changed. The king's guard, the solemn soldier who had stood motionless before her, was not someone to be joked with or disregarded. He was a person with a responsibility, a deep-seated duty that went far beyond being part of a tourist attraction. "Are you serious?" Sarah had blurted out, still reeling from the shock. Her words had come out much sharper than she intended. She hadn't meant to sound confrontational, but there was a hint of defiance in her voice. She wasn't used to being told what to do by strangers, especially when she didn't understand why they were doing it. After all, she was just having fun, right? But the guard's response was unyielding, his eyes locked firmly ahead. "I said step back," he repeated, his voice steady and firm, cutting through the murmur of the crowd. His boots clacked sharply against the pavement as he took a step toward her. Sarah could feel his presence growing more imposing with each second. The guard's stature was intimidating, not just physically, but in the way he carried himself, in the way he commanded attention without uttering a single word of explanation. He didn't need to. Sarah's face flushed with heat as she took an instinctive step back. She felt embarrassed now, but part of her still couldn't shake off the disbelief. She had thought that he was simply being a part of the experience, like a character in a performance. She didn't realize that for him, this was far more than just standing still for photos. It was about upholding a tradition, a role that carried centuries of history and expectation. For a brief moment, Sarah considered saying something in return, maybe defending herself or trying to explain that she hadn't meant any disrespect. But the look on the guard's face was enough to stop her. He wasn't interested in hearing excuses. His duty was to maintain discipline, to ensure that his presence meant something beyond the surface level of a tourist attraction. It was a lesson that Sarah had just begun to understand. She looked at Jane, hoping for some reassurance, but Jane, too, seemed caught off guard. She had been snapping photos just a few moments earlier, laughing along with Sarah. But now she stood silent, her camera hanging loosely by her side. The carefree mood they had shared moments ago had vanished, replaced by an awkward tension that neither of them knew how to handle. "I didn't mean to offend him," Sarah said softly, her voice barely audible as she finally spoke again. She was still processing everything that had just happened. "I just wanted a nice photo, you know." Jane nodded slowly, her eyes scanning the guard, who had returned to his position, standing tall and motionless. The fact that he had reacted so forcefully made it clear that Sarah's actions had crossed a boundary. But what was that boundary, exactly? Why was he so upset over something as harmless as a photo? Sarah's mind raced with these questions, but there was no one around who could provide a clear answer. The tourists nearby, who had been watching the scene unfold, quickly turned their attention back to their own activities, as though the moment had already passed. But for Sarah, it hadn't passed. It was still lingering in the air, filling her with an uncomfortable mix of confusion and shame. She wanted to shake off the feeling, to move on and enjoy the rest of her day, but it wasn't that easy. She couldn't ignore the lesson that had just been delivered in such a sudden and forceful way. After a few moments of awkward silence, Sarah took a deep breath. "Maybe we should just go," she suggested, her voice hesitant. Jane nodded, and they both started to slowly walk away from the guard, the weight of the situation still heavy on their minds. As they moved further away from the palace, Sarah's thoughts continued to swirl. She kept replaying the exchange in her head, trying to figure out what she had done wrong. Why had the guard reacted so strongly? Was it because of how close she had gotten to him? Or had it been the fact that she had treated him like an exhibit, like a piece of the palace's decor? She didn't know the answer, but she was beginning to understand something important. The guard wasn't just standing there as a passive part of the scenery. He was a person doing a job that required respect. Respect not just for him, but for everything he represented. The British monarchy, the history of the nation, and the deep traditions that had been upheld for generations. It wasn't about her, or anyone else's desire for a perfect Instagram photo. It was about something much bigger. By the time Sarah and Jane reached the gates of the palace, Sarah felt a shift inside her. The embarrassment and confusion that had overwhelmed her earlier were now being replaced by a quiet realization. She hadn't just been told off by a guard. She had been given a lesson in respect, a lesson she would carry with her throughout the rest of her time in London. It wasn't just about obeying rules. It was about understanding the significance of the moment, the history behind the ceremony, and the role that each person, from the monarch to the guards, played in the story of the country. It wasn't something she had fully understood before, but now, as she stood there outside the palace gates, she could feel the weight of it. She glanced back toward the palace, her eyes briefly meeting the figure of the guard, still standing in his post, as unyielding as ever. And for the first time, she understood. Sarah walked in silence for a while, her thoughts racing as she and Jane continued to make their way down the street. The air around them felt thicker now, laden with the weight of what had just transpired. It was a sharp contrast to the carefree excitement they had felt just an hour before, when they had first arrived at Buckingham Palace. The mood had shifted, and Sarah couldn't shake the lingering sense of discomfort. As they passed through the gates, Sarah glanced over her shoulder at the palace, her eyes drawn to the guard still standing by the entrance. He hadn't moved a muscle since they'd left, still unwavering, still imposing. She couldn't help but admire the composure he maintained, even after the brief confrontation. He wasn't angry, just resolute. It was as if he was above it all, focused solely on the task at hand. The guard, in his red uniform and bearskin hat, wasn't just a figurehead or a tourist attraction. He was a symbol of something deeper, something far more significant than Sarah had initially realized. As they walked further away, Jane spoke up, breaking the silence. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice soft and tentative. She had been watching Sarah closely ever since the incident, unsure of what to say or how to address the tension that had settled between them. "I don't know," Sarah replied, her voice distant. "I just don't understand why he got so upset. I mean, I wasn't doing anything bad, right?" Jane thought for a moment before answering. I think he was just doing his job, Sarah. It's not like he's there to entertain us. I mean, we've seen the guards before, right? We always hear about how serious they are. It's not a show. Sarah nodded slowly, trying to process Jane's words. I guess. I didn't think of it like that, she admitted. I thought he was just part of the whole experience, like something we could take a picture with. I didn't realize he was actually protecting something, representing something. Jane smiled faintly. Yeah, that's what I think too. We take all this history for granted sometimes. Like, we're here to have fun, but it's not like that for them. They're doing something important. Sarah felt a flicker of realization. Jane was right. They were tourists, there for the sights, the selfies, the stories. But the guard wasn't just standing there for their amusement. His role, his duty, was tied to a deep history, one that Sarah had overlooked. She hadn't known the weight of the traditions he was upholding, and she hadn't understood the pride that came with his position. He wasn't a part of the spectacle, he was the embodiment of it. The more Sarah thought about it, the more she understood that she had failed to recognize the seriousness of the moment. It wasn't just about being in a famous place or taking a photo with a person in a fancy uniform. It was about acknowledging the significance of what he represented, the history, the legacy, the honor. He wasn't a performer in a tourist attraction. He was a protector of history, a person who had committed his life to a cause that demanded discipline, respect, and unwavering focus. But Sarah also realized that she had unintentionally disrespected that role. She had been so caught up in her own excitement in the rush of the moment that she had treated the guard like an accessory, not recognizing the responsibility he bore. And in doing so, she had broken a silent but important boundary. The more she thought about it, the more she could see how her actions had been careless. It wasn't about the selfie or the picture. It was about the way she had approached the guard, as if he were just part of the scenery, there for her entertainment. She had crossed a line, not maliciously, but ignorantly. And it wasn't until the guard had spoken to her with such authority that she realized the gravity of what she had done. Sarah's feelings of discomfort slowly turned into something else, something more reflective. It wasn't just embarrassment anymore. It was a deeper understanding. She had learned a valuable lesson, one that extended far beyond the boundaries of the palace grounds. It wasn't just about following rules or taking the perfect picture. It was about recognizing the people, the traditions, and the cultures around you and understanding their value. She wasn't just a tourist in London anymore. She was someone who had learned something important. She had learned that respect wasn't something to be taken lightly. It wasn't just about being polite. It was about recognizing the dignity in the people and the places around you. She had been too quick to treat the king's guard as something to be admired from a distance, not realizing that they were much more than statues. They were people who held roles that demanded respect, not just from her, but from anyone who crossed their path. As Sarah continued to walk, she felt a shift inside her. The rest of the afternoon stretched out before her, full of new possibilities. She wasn't sure what her next stop would be, but she knew one thing for certain. She would approach the rest of her time in London with a newfound awareness. She would take the time to learn about the history behind the places she visited, the traditions that shaped them, and the people who upheld those traditions. She would make a point to approach everything with respect, understanding that her experience as a tourist wasn't just about sightseeing. It was about participating in something much bigger. Later that evening, as Sarah and Jane sat in a small cafe, sipping coffee and reflecting on their day, Sarah couldn't help but bring up the guard again. I still don't think I fully get it, she said, her voice thoughtful. But I think I understand why he did what he did. It wasn't just about me taking a picture. It was about everything he represented. Jane nodded, her eyes kind. Yeah, it's easy to forget that sometimes. We're in this amazing city with all this history, but it's easy to get lost in the fun and forget that some things are bigger than us, bigger than our selfies and our pictures. "I'll never forget it," Sarah said, her eyes distant as she stared out the window at the dimming streets of London. "It's more than just a photo. It's about respecting the people who make that history real, you know." Jane smiled, raising her cup in a small toast. Here's to learning something new every day. Sarah raised her cup in return, a quiet sense of gratitude washing over her. She didn't just learn about the history of London that day, she had learned something even more valuable, the importance of respect. And that lesson would stay with her long after her trip ended. The next few days of Sarah's trip were filled with new experiences, but the lesson she had learned from her encounter with the King's Guard stayed with her every step of the way. As she walked through the bustling streets of London, Sarah couldn't help but reflect on that moment outside Buckingham Palace. It had been an awkward, uncomfortable situation, but in the end, it had changed something deep within her. The more she thought about it, the more she understood how easy it was to overlook the deeper significance of things when you're caught up in the excitement of travel. London, with its centuries of history and tradition, had a way of reminding her that there was so much more to the world than the instant gratification of a photo or a quick, fleeting moment. She realized that the guard, with his unwavering stance and silent authority, wasn't just there to make the palace look impressive. He was a living link to the past, standing guard over something much more than just a building. Sarah's experiences over the next few days made her more aware of the people and places around her. She visited museums, historical sites, and landmarks, but this time, she viewed them through a different lens. Everywhere she went, she paid attention to the stories behind the places. She asked questions, listened carefully to the guides, and took time to reflect on the rich histories that shaped the city. It wasn't just about the Instagram moments anymore. It was about truly seeing the places she visited, understanding their significance, and acknowledging the people who had made them what they were. She noticed the small details, the worn cobblestones beneath her feet, the intricately carved stonework on ancient buildings, the quiet reverence with which people spoke about the city's history. It was no longer just a collection of photo opportunities. It was a living, breathing part of the world's history, and Sarah felt honored to witness it. One evening, as Sarah and Jane sat on the steps outside the National Gallery, overlooking Trafalgar Square, Sarah couldn't hold back any longer. The thought had been building inside her all week, and now, in the quiet of the evening, she finally had to say it. "You know, I've been thinking a lot about that moment with the guard. I'm still a little embarrassed by it, but I also think it taught me something important." Jane looked up from her phone, where she had been scrolling through photos. "What do you mean?" "I think I was too caught up in the tourist side of things," Sarah began, her voice thoughtful. "I was so focused on getting the perfect photo, the perfect experience, that I forgot there's a real history behind everything we see. And the guard. He wasn't just standing there for fun, he had a purpose. He was representing something bigger than all of us." Jane nodded, her expression reflecting a quiet understanding. "Yeah, I get it. We sometimes forget that, don't we? When we travel, we want everything to be fun and easy. But there's always a deeper meaning to everything. We just have to look for it." "I guess that's what I missed that day," Sarah said, the words coming out almost like a confession. "I saw the guard as part of the spectacle, like something to pose with in a photo, not as someone with a role that's tied to centuries of tradition. I didn't realize that his presence there was about more than just standing still in a uniform. It was about respect, respect for the past, for the history he's guarding, and for the people who came before us." Jane smiled gently, her eyes soft. "I think that's what makes travel so special. We don't just go to see the sights, we go to understand them, to connect with the history, and sometimes it takes moments like that one to remind us of that." As the conversation drifted, Sarah realized how much her perspective had changed. The trip had become about more than just sightseeing. It had become about learning. She was no longer rushing from one landmark to the next, trying to tick off items on a list. Instead, she was taking the time to understand the significance of the places she visited, to feel the weight of history that hung in the air. She was finally seeing beyond the surface of things, not just with her eyes but with her heart and mind. The following day, as Sarah stood in front of the Tower of London, she took a deep breath, appreciating the old stone walls, the centuries of history, and the stories that echoed through the ages. She had read about the tower's history, about the prisoners who had been held there, and the many events that had shaped the course of British history. She felt a quiet reverence, understanding that the place wasn't just a tourist spot. It was a monument to the past, to the triumphs and tragedies that had unfolded within its walls. As she walked through the exhibits and listened to the guide stories, Sarah was struck by how much she had missed in the past, how easy it had been to overlook the true significance of a place because she had been too focused on the immediate experience, the excitement of being there. Now she saw the people who had shaped the tower's history, the struggles they had endured, and the deep connection they had to the land. She wasn't just a visitor, she was a part of something much bigger than herself. She was walking in the footsteps of those who had come before her, carrying with her the lessons they had left behind. Later that day, Sarah found herself in a small, quiet bookstore near Covent Garden, browsing through a collection of books on British history. She picked up one on the royal family, flipping through the pages, reading about the monarchs and their reigns, the wars and victories, the sacrifices made along the way. For the first time, she felt truly connected to the history of the country, not just as a tourist, but as someone who had come to appreciate the deep, rich tapestry of experiences that had shaped the present. That evening, as she and Jane sat in a cozy cafe, Sarah couldn't help but share her thoughts again. "I feel like I'm seeing London in a new way," she said, her voice full of quiet excitement. "It's not just a city with cool buildings and famous landmarks. It's a city with a soul, a history that goes back centuries. And I feel like I'm part of that story now, too. The guard that day, as uncomfortable as it was the beginning of me understanding all of this." Jane smiled, her expression warm. "It's amazing how a single moment can change the way we see things. I'm glad you've had that realization. It sounds like this trip is turning into something more than just a vacation." "I think it is," Sarah said, her eyes bright with newfound understanding. "It's not just about visiting places anymore. It's about learning from them. And the people who help preserve that history, the guards, the historians, the people who live here, they're all part of something much bigger than we are." As the evening wore on and the streets of London continued to bustle outside, Sarah felt a quiet sense of gratitude settle over her. She had come to London expecting to see the sights, to capture the perfect moments. But what she had found, what she had learned, was something much more valuable. She had found a deeper connection to the world around her, one that would stay with her long after she left the city. She smiled softly to herself, knowing that this experience had changed her. And for that, she would be forever grateful.